President of court, please let's have quiet in the courtroom.
Decision number 53, it is decided to admit in evidence the diary by the lawyer Jochen Yekuel, accompanied by the affidavit of Moissis. May I call the attention of the court to a number of passages in the diary.
I have marked this as Exhibit T1134.
I shall read from the Hebrew translation and will mention the number of the page at the head of each page. On page 2, the first paragraph, the very run-down condition of the Jews in Saloniki upon the entry of the Germans. This has already been mentioned. And then the diary goes on to describe the special enterprise for the nourishment of children, which reached 2,000 children, served meals free. And on page 3 in the second paragraph, the first year from 41 to June 42, and he writes that the German approach was without aim and without plan during the first 15 months. On page 5, in the first paragraph of the third chapter, the first laws by the military rule in Saloniki Aegis. On page 6, we come upon the events of the early hours of the Saturday. The court heard about this Shabbat from another witness. In the third paragraph, the court will see how pictures reached our hands from what took place in the public square on that morning. I come now to page 34. I'm sorry, but I believe there's a mistake. Regarding a mission to Athens, and that at the time a high Gestapo officer arrived to Saloniki and wanted information in regard to the life of the Jewish community, and flew directly back to Berlin. This is now clear that this was Ginter who replaced the accused at the time. I believe, says Mr. Bauer, that he was mistaken. The number of the page was 21. No, it is on page 21.
אדוני קורא מן המקור, אני אמרתי אתייחס פשוט בית המשפט לעמודי הטקסט.
The discussion is that it is on page 33 in the original, but in the Hebrew translation it is page 21. I come now to page 23 of the Hebrew translation. Here we meet the German officers Wislizeni and Brunner, mentioned for the first time in this diary, described as the Brunner who solves the Jewish problem in Vienna. They remain and hand over their instructions to the community after informing them that not the military command, but the SS department will be responsible for actions against the Jews. And then on page 24 says so clearly that the implementation was handed over to the SS office. Further details the court may find on page 24 in the fourth paragraph, where there are also figures in regard to the Jews in Saloniki, 50,000 Jews, and the way Brunner behaved when he came to hand over his instructions and give his orders in the offices of the community, and the way the community was ordered to implement the instructions issued by the Gestapo. I come now to page 28. Here, there is an important paragraph about the successful attempt made to win the sympathy of the Christian population in that part of Greece to help their Jewish neighbors. To win the sympathy of the Christian population in that part of Greece to help their Jewish neighbors. A very rousing story will be found by the end of the page 29 and the beginning of page 30 until the last first paragraph. It relates here that a Christian woman sees a Jewess with a Jewish star for the first time and asks her to come to her and recognizes she was laughing, and the Christian woman thought that this was a joke. She turns to the Jewish maid on the balcony and says, "Why are you laughing? They are people as we are. Maybe our turn will come tomorrow. Why do you laugh?" On page 32, in the fifth paragraph, we see the introduction of the orders to register Jewish property, the beginning of the collection of taxes, which they believed that this was all the Germans wanted, that they were not after their lives but after their money. And on page 34, the diary is broken in the middle of the word Jews in the Greek army. And we know from the attached affidavit that after his escape to Athens, the writer was arrested, was taken to Auschwitz, and died there. He was arrested in Athens. He escaped to Athens. When the Germans entered Athens, he escaped to Athens from Saloniki, and when the Germans came to Athens, he was arrested and sent to Auschwitz. In Moissis' affidavit, these details are given. May I beg for the patience of the court? This must be read with a letter by the editor to the Attorney General in Frankfurt and authenticates this handwriting. This is a photostatic copy of a letter written to his sister.
Where did Klepper leave his diary at the time?
It seems that in the hands of his acquaintances, of friends, and then after the war, the diary was published. I believe that in accordance with paragraph 15, the court may be convinced, if the court wishes, that this indeed is the diary of Jochen Klepper.
President of Court, was this published in book form too?
At least twice. The passage I wish to quote, and the one I just read, the last part of the diary, was published in a book, You Visited Me Tonight, which appeared in München in the year 1960. The whole diary of Jochen Klepper was published by another publisher in Stuttgart even earlier.
President of Court, did you say you also want to submit a copy of a letter from the publisher who says that he obtained the handwriting, a sample of the handwriting from the sister of the poet?
Yes, sir. This is Raul Hildegard Klepper of Berlin, his sister.
President of Court, Dr. Savatius, have you got any comments on this diary?
Ich habe keinen Eindruck. Indeed, not good.
I have no objections. President of Court, the poet is no longer alive. He was taken with his wife and children on the 10th of... He committed suicide with his family in 1942.
Decision number 5-4. We admit the excerpts from the diary of Jochen Klepper with the authentication of its handwriting in accordance with paragraph 15 of the law Punishment of Nazis and Their Collaborators, 1950. Mr. Barreau, I have completed the documents I wished to submit.
Mr. Bach, Your Honors, in connection with Mr. Bach is waiting for the President of the Court to complete the marking of the previous exhibit.
T 1135.
Mr. Bach, in connection with the Slovakian chapter, I should still like to draw your attention to three passages from Vyslitseni's, the transcript of Vyslitseni's examination. That was our number 856. I believe it was marked Exhibit T57. The Secretary of the Court will correct me if this is not the correct number. It was T56. I stand corrected. Now, this examination on the 14th of November 1945, here on pages 4 and 5, Vyslitseni reports how he had been sent by the accused to Slovakia, and says that his duty, he received the following instructions.
On all questions relating to the Jewish problem, to strive insofar as possible to see to it that the Slovak Jewish legislation should be assimilated insofar as possible to the German. This was the central point or nucleus of the instructions. Everything else was left to me personally.
Who gave him these instructions, he says? Mr. Bach, he said that Günther and Eichmann gave him the instructions, the directives to try and coordinate as much as possible the anti-Jewish legislation by the Slovakian authorities with the German legislation against the Jews. Afterwards, in his investigation on the 15th of November 1940 of the same year, on page 14, '13 and 14. On page 13, he speaks about the negotiations with the Jewish organizations, and Eichmann told him to stop that completely.
He would have no hesitancy about dropping me entirely, that he would not protect me against any action by his superiors. שהוא לא יגן עליו בפני הממונים עליו כתוצאה מהמשא ומתן הזה.
And he adds that when this was mentioned here on page 14 about the desire by the Slovakian authorities to send a mission to inspect the camps, when he finally told them where the Jews were going,
the Slovaks won't be able to see their Jews anymore because they are no longer alive. סלובקים לא יוכלו לראות את היהודים שלהם יותר כי הם אינם יותר בחיים.
And the last passage in that same examination on page 21, he spoke several times about Alois Brunner, and he refers to him always as Schweinehund, pig and dog. And the examiner asks him,
Schweinehund in connection with Brunner's name. Why did you do that? The answer, he was an extremely unscrupulous individual, one of the best tools of Eichmann. He never had an opinion of his own, and as Eichmann himself described him, he was one of my best men.
In quotes, of course.
לא הייתה לו דעה עצמאית, ואייכמן הגדיר אותו כאחד מאנשיו הטובים ביותר. עכשיו, כבוד בית המשפט,
Now, your honors,
ההליך התיאור של סריקת
in the course of the description of the roundup of Jews in Europe from east to west and their deportation to the camps in the east, we now get to the last country which we want to describe, namely Hungary. Here, Your Honors, we must distinguish between two periods. The period until the 19th of March 1944 and from that date onwards, when the German army entered Hungary and the accused acted inside Hungary itself. I would like to submit a number of documents first, which refer to the first period until the 19th of March 1944. The first document, our number 163, it was shown to the accused and was marked T37 brackets 88. The question arose whether there was any room to deport Jews who ran away from Hungary and found refuge somewhere else. The accused, as he did elsewhere, again objected to a partial operation about Hungary. He says it wouldn't be proper to employ this entire apparatus just to catch these Jews who escaped into Hungary, because this apparatus has to be used elsewhere. He thinks it would be desirable to wait with this operation until Hungary will be prepared to take action against its own Jews. That will be T1136. Incidentally, a letter to the German Foreign Ministry dated 25th of September 1942. Our next document, 1242.
Luther sends a memorandum to the German legation in Budapest, trying to influence the Hungarian government to show understanding towards the German plan of the final solution of the Jewish problem, and to agree to the mocking of Jews and their deportation to the
President
east.
of Court, something is missing here. We have 2 pages, right? Mr. Bach, 3 pages even. President of Court, there are 2 incomplete copies here. We have one copy which has only 2 copies which have only 2 pages. The Hebrew translation, but not the German original.
Then I may submit one complete document in German. Do you now have, Your Honors, 3 copies?
President of Court, we now have 2 2/3, in fact. Do you have another one? Mr. Bach.
No, maybe I may submit the German copy, as I said.
That is Exhibit T 1137.
Herr Präsident, wenn ich zu diesem Dokument eine Bemerkung machen darf. Es ist hier eine wesentliche Stelle in diesem Schreiben enthalten. Und zwar heißt es hier, entsprechend unseren Wünschen und Anregungen auf diesem Gebiet soll vorgegangen werden. Ausnahmebehandlung ungarischer Juden. Und dann heißt es auf der Seite 2...
President of Court, just one moment, Dr. Savatius. What page are you quoting
Seite habe ich
from?
nur den Sinn herausgenommen und nicht zitiert.
Doch.
Das Wesentliche ist auf der 2. Seite. Dort heißt es in der Mitte, schwieriger, aber auch dringlicher erweist sich das Problem der Judenbehandlung in Ungarn selbst. Bitte daher ungarische Regierungen Gründe auseinanderzusetzen, die uns bewegen, nach dem Willen des Führers eine baldige und vollständige Lösung der Judenfrage in Europa anzustreben und die ungarische Regierung zu bitten, auch ihrerseits die dazu erforderlichen Maßnahmen vorwärts zu treiben. Das ist also das Auswärtige Amt, was hier schreibt.
Dr. Savatius, Mr. Presiding Judge, may I make one remark in connection with this document? There is an important passage here. It says, in accordance with this spirit, this must be done in accordance with the spirit of our instruction. This is not on the first page. I'm just quoting the spirit of the thing. But on the second page, it says, it is more complicated, but at the same time it is more urgent. This is the problem of the treatment of the Jews in Hungary itself. Therefore, I should like to make it clear to the Hungarian government what the reasons are which have induced us to strive, according to the Führer's wish, towards a speedy and complete solution of the Jewish problem in Europe, and to ask the Hungarian government for its part to promote the necessary measures. Mr. Bach, I am grateful to the Defense Counsel for having drawn your attention to this passage, which indeed is important. Mr. Bach, our next document is number 510. It was shown to the accused, marked T37-164. It's signed by Müller, but was drafted in 4B4. Müller here asked permission to permit isolated Jews to leave Holland and Slovakia in exchange for a payment of 100,000 Swiss francs, and that money will enable the recruitment of volunteers for the Waffen-SS in Hungary. He says that in Holland there were 8 such cases. President of Court, do you have an extra copy? We have an extra copy of the German original, but we are lacking a Hebrew original. It's just because I couldn't see the markings in the original. That's why I am asking. Where do you take this from, sir? Mr. Bach, I'll tell you, Your Honor, the original is annexed to the statement, and apparently there the marking 4B4 is quite clear, but only in this reprint, in this photocopy, it was a little unclear, but here the number is quite legible. And how does it appear in the translation? Mr. Bach? This was edited according to the photostatic copy, which was found, which we can find in T37-64. There one can see this quite clearly.
Where is this T37? Which T37?
It is T37-164. Incidentally, Your Honor will see in the reference on top, it says letter from 4B4 on the same subject.
We shall have a further copy later from the translation.
We shall gladly submit it. He also recalls that there were 8 such cases in Holland with regard to 28 Dutch Jews, where in fact they applied this right.
T1137. I'm sorry, says the President of Court, this is a mistake. And the number of this last document is Exhibit T 1138. Our following document is number 972. Here, Klingenfuss of the Foreign Office on the 7th of December 1942 reports to Eichmann in regard to a discussion in the Hungarian parliament about working camps for Jews and the work of Christian women in Jewish houses. He points out that this legislation does not advance as desired. T1139. Our following document.
Our next document, war number 1341, signed by Günther 4B4A of the 5th of April 1943. It shows the abysmal hatred of these people. They speak about 150 Jews, including attorneys, industrialists, merchants, and other intellectuals, as Günther says, who are employed in a labor camp near the railroad tracks not far from the border, and once a day they are permitted to have a hot meal in a restaurant, a same restaurant frequented by German railroad officials, and they are forced to eat there with the Jews. And he says he will ask that measures be taken to stop this from security reasons, and both from, as he points it, so that these customs officials can really not be asked to come in such close contact with the Jews. It is too much to ask of these officials to have such contact with the Jews. Yes, intellectuals, he says there. He stresses lawyers, industrialists, and such like intellectuals, as he put it. I should like to say this was in a period when Hungary was not occupied and the accused was not there yet.
T1140. Our following document is 519, our serial number, signed by the accused, Eichmann, addressed to the German Foreign Office in regard to a Jew named Oskar Trenk, of Hungarian nationality, it says here, and he says that there were no documents to prove Hungarian nationality. Therefore, these people were considered as stateless and were sent to the working camps to the east. His present whereabouts are unknown. This is the haughty period, asks the President of Court.
Mr. Bach, yes, sir, it was. It was the haughty period. That is Exhibit T1141. Mr. Bach, our next document 523 was shown to the accused and was marked T37 in brackets 160. Here they speak about measures for the evacuation of Jews who have Hungarian nationality.
The evacuation from the German Reich, asks the President of Court.
Mr. Bach, yes, evacuation from the Reich, but apparently there was some kind of intervention on part of the Hungarian government through the German Foreign Ministry. The Hungarians took an interest in these Jews. And they say the present whereabouts of the Jews who were sent to the east is not to be determined, and the attitude of the Hungarian Consulate General and Legation to have them returned to Germany, this cannot be complied with on grounds of principle. These, of course, I again wish to point out, were Hungarian nationals who were in the Reich then and were deported to the east.
This is T1142. Our following document is 546. and points out to the rule and authority Eichmann had over Theresian and Bergen-Belsen. The question was if Jews of Hungarian citizenship must be kept in Bergen-Belsen or they must be transferred to Theresienstadt. And for various reasons of convenience, Eichmann lays down that there are more suitable conditions in Theresienstadt, and I stress the last sentence. I therefore instructed the commander of the security office in Prague to relieve the Jews concerned in Theresienstadt. The Secretary of Court mentions that this was already admitted, and
what number did it receive then?
851, T851.
President of Court. It may have been submitted in connection with Theresienstadt before, says Mr. Bach. Our next document, 521, it was shown to the accused and marked T37, brackets 157. The subject here is Jews by the name of Goldberger. Yes, 157. A Jew named Goldberger, together with his family, they emigrated to Belgium. They were Czechoslovak subjects, and they were taken to the east for forced labor. Their present whereabouts cannot be established. This man also had Hungarian nationality. Eichmann wrote a letter to von Taden, 25th of January, 1944.
T1143. Our next document is 1644. This is a lengthy report by Wesenmeyer from the year 1943, December 43. And the importance of this document is on the last page of this document, the 7th paragraph. Here, and in fact all through this document, Wesenmeyer hints that it is desirable that German forces come into Hungary, but the 7th paragraph points out that one of the main reasons for this proposed action is what he calls the solution of the Jewish problem in Hungary. T1144. Go ahead.
Now, Your Honors, we get to 1944, the date when the Germans entered Hungary. Our document 1021 of the very same date, the 19th of March 1944. It's a report from Wesenmeyer to the Foreign Ministry saying that he had reached Budapest and taken over the affairs. He describes his entry into Budapest and says later, for 3/4 of an hour I was with our representative alone. I introduced myself and I told him that I was with Horthy, and I told Horthy that I was charged with the duty of forming together with him the new government.
Were there any exchanges of ambassadors at that time? Wesenbayer, after all, was an ambassador later on.
Mr. Bach, yes, that's true. At that time, he just had arrived for the first time. He came with the armed forces. First, they had Yagor as the ambassador.
I see here another name mentioned. Botschafter Ritter, Envoy Ritter.
Mr. Bach, yes, but I do not know whether he was in Budapest at that time or whether this was just the way in which this letter was channeled to Ribbentrop. You see, sir, in the second paragraph, Ambassador von Yagov was with Horthy this morning. But apparently the message was sent to Ribbentrop via this envoy Ritter.
Was it preceded by a meeting between Horthy and Hitler?
Mr. Bach, yes, sir. We know about this meeting. In the Kastner report, this matter is also mentioned.
A few days afterwards, before it, how was it?
This was on the 19th of March, and I think the meeting was 2 days before. And then this action took place, the entry of the German troops into Hungary. At this stage, by permission of court,
T1155.
At this stage, with your permission, I should like to call on our next witness, Mr. Pinchas Freudiger.
Interesting. It will be interesting now. Quiet, please, asked the presiding judge. Quiet, please. Do you swear or do you give a solemn affirmation?
I affirm that my testimony in this trial will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. What is your name, sir?
Pinchas Freudiger, formerly Philip Freudiger.
Sir, you may testify while being seated, if you wish.
He doesn't speak to the microphone. He doesn't speak to the microphone.
Please proceed and reply to Mr. Bach's questions. Mr. Bach, Mr. Freudiger, you were born in Budapest?
Yes.
Did you also go to school in Budapest? And you worked in a factory there? A factory founded by your uncle?
Yes.
What products did this factory make?
Textiles and clothing.
Your grandfather was one of the founders of the Orthodox community in Budapest?
Yes, Moshe Freudiger.
Were you also active in the Orthodox congregation?
Yes, after my grandfather, my father was head of the community for about 26 years, and after his death in 1939, I was called to replace him, to take his place, up to 1944.
What were the relations between your family and the ruling circles in Hungary, sir? Before the war broke out, I mean.
As my family was a Hungarian family of an old stock of over 100 years, we also set up the factory which was serving the Hungarian army and serving the purpose of Hungarian institutions. Therefore, the relationships between us and the leading Hungarian circles were extremely good. We had extensive relationships with the police authorities, with the security forces, etc.
Your grandfather, in fact, was made a nobleman.
As a matter of fact, our family was ennobled.
Was this inherited by you?
Yes, this was hereditary nobility, which passed on to me as well.
How many Jews lived in Hungary before the war broke out?
In 1939, there were about 500,000 Jews, perhaps a bit less, 80,000 perhaps.
Could you tell the court what the changes were that took place in the boundaries of Hungary and how this affected the Jews?
I do not recollect the dates exactly, but as far as I remember, after Munich, after the government of Slovakia had been set up, it was in 1938, Hungary got a southern part of Slovakia, and then gradually Hungary got the Karpatha Russia, or Podkarpatska Rus as it's called, and at a later stage the northern part of Transylvania was also incorporated to Hungary, and later also a northern part of Yugoslavia. These changes took place in the period between 1938 and up to the end of 1940. This way the Hungarian population had been increased from 8 million or slightly over 8 million to 12 or 13 million Hungarians, and the number of Jews of course was also affected from 500,000 up to 800,000.
When did Hungary enter the war alongside the Axis powers?
In June 1941. Hungary declared war on Russia and also on the United States at a later stage. As far as I remember, the United States did not declare war on Hungary.
Now, you said there were 800,000 Jews. Were there, this include a number of converted Jews? How many would you say?
I can't tell the court exactly, but there were over 100,000 converted Jews. I estimated at 100 to 150,000 Jews who were converted.
Could you tell the court what the attitude of the Hungarian government to the Jews was up until 1944?
The anti-Semitic waves, which began after the First World War in 1919, were faded into oblivion. In 1927, even the economic life was more or less settled and stabilized. There was prosperity in the whole of Central Europe, and this prosperity also affected Hungary, and this was one of the reasons why the life of Hungarian Jewry was more or less normal in 1927, 1928, and the anti-Semitic circles of 1920 actually were left with two things. They had only two achievements. One was the numerus clausus, that means to say that there was a limited number of Jews admitted, namely only 6% of the students were to be Jews. And even if we say that this was in itself not disastrous, because our boys would go abroad to study to France, Italy and Germany, and would come back with their diplomas, but there was one law which was actually running counter to the Hungarian legislation. According to the Hungarian legislation, Jewry was religion, as a matter of fact. But there the Jews were not admitted because they were members of a certain religion, but this was actually a different matter, because here the students to the university were accepted according to race. That means to say that Jews began to be regarded as an alien body. And the second hangover of anti-Semitism was reflected in other avenues of life. There were always anti-Semites in Hungary as well as elsewhere. But in Hungary there were parties based on the anti-Semitic premise. There was an organization of Hungarian conservatives. This was a party called the Party for the Defense of the Race, Rassenschutz.
What period is this?
I'm referring to the period in the year 1920, 1930. And this way, gradually, the notion crystallized that Jews in Hungary constitute an alien body, that a pure Hungarian is certainly not a Jew.
Mr. Freudiger, what was the attitude to the Jews from the outbreak of the war until March of 1944?
The anti-Semitic line of a more acute nature began even prior to the outbreak of the war. This was actually immediately after the Anschluss of Austria in March 1938, when actually the anti-Semitic line made itself felt. Then the first anti-Jewish law was enacted. This law was not yet called anti-Jewish law, but it was called the law for the restoration of social balance, as it were. And this was immediately following in the wake of the Anschluss in Austria. Whether it was under the influence of the Nazis, which came closer to the borders of Hungary, this is our social balance, as it were. And this was immediately following in the wake of the Anschluss in Austria. Whether it was under the influence of the Nazis, which came closer to the borders of Hungary, this is after all self-evident. This was in April 1938, and in December of that same year, after Hungary had retrieved part of Czechoslovakia, the government had already promulgated the first anti-Jewish law, which was much sterner than the first law, but this was not yet based on the notion of race. It was not yet based on the Nuremberg laws. Only the Jewish rights and privileges were curtailed. In 1941, 1 month after Hungary had declared war on Russia, the third law was promulgated. This was a blatantly anti-Jewish law, already based on the Nuremberg laws.
Now, you mentioned 1941. Do you remember a certain event which happened in 1941 and which damaged many Hungarian Jews?
Yes, this was the first deportation from Hungary. As I pointed out, the second anti-Semitic law in 1938 curtailed the privileges of Jews and also referred to the nationality problem of Jews, and many Jews on the regions restored to Hungary. The Jews who were born in these regions did not get Hungarian nationality, and those who were not Hungarian nationals were not allowed to live in Hungary, and in pursuance of that particular law, the Jews had to be deported. They got a deportation order. Later on, they would secure extension of their stay because there was no possibility of deporting them. But in 1941, after the German army had occupied Volhynia and the Ukraine and Belarus, one of the leading personalities of the Hungarian security police came with a suggestion that now there is a territory where the Jews could be deported to, the Jews who, as a matter of principle, had no right to stay in Hungary. And he took advantage of this opportunity that the Hungarian Minister of the Interior was on leave. This was actually his summer leave. It happened on the 17th of Tammuz, and this man elicited an order from the deputy of the Minister of the Interior to deport the stateless Jews to Galicia.
Now, how many Jews were affected by this deportation, and where were they deported to?
The objective was to get about 100,000 Jews or even more. They began to deport them to a small place at first on the border, Kereshmese. And in the course of a fortnight or 3 weeks, these 17,500 Jews were expelled to Galicia.
Were these Jews picked from certain localities or from all over the country?
As a matter of fact, they stemmed from all parts of Hungary. For instance, my clerk who was working in my factory, who was actually born in Budapest, but who was of Austrian nationality, was also taken and sent to Galicia. But of course, the prevailing number of deputies were hailing from the newly incorporated parts of Hungary.
Now, Mr. Freudiger, where did these Jews ultimately get to? Where were they taken to?
They were sent to Galicia, and thereafter a considerable number of them have reached Kamenets-Podolsk.
Where is that?
This is between Galicia and Volhynia. Before it belonged to Russia. And about 17 to 18,000 people. Only out of 17,000 or 18,000, about 2,000
only two returned.
And 2,000 simply fled, and they remained in Galicia, and gradually they were being transferred to the east, and then we received an announcement. Then in Kamenets-Podolsky, about 12,000 people of these Jews were killed
in one day.
All the inhabitants of Kamenets-Podolsky were killed, and among them the Jews. These people were killed by the Germans.
Mr. Freudiger, you told us about the anti-Jewish legislation, which at that stage was mostly economic in nature. Now, between 1941 and 1944, March 1944, was there a radical change in these anti-Jewish laws?
From 1941 up to shortly later, not. There was of course the aftermath of 1941. I can't say that certain properties were being dealt with, but at that time there were no severer laws at that time. In spite of all the difficulties and stumbling blocks in 1941 I just referred to, such as a deportation of a considerable number of Hungarian Jews, we still had the right to help the Slovakian refugees, and in 1941 to refugees from Galicia. And we really took care of them.
When were labor camps set up for Jews?
The labor camps or labor service?
I understand it was called labor service, yes. But I understand the people were kept in certain camps.
No, I think this is an error. The labor service was based on a law of 1939, which gave the right to the Hungarian army to avail itself of people to whom they do not want to give weapons because they have no confidence in them. And these people were compelled to serve the country by entering the labor service. This was not stated in the law that this was against the Jew, but this was most obviously an anti-Jewish measure. And then the labor service was ushered in 1940, but at the outset only certain works were done. Of course, it was not very pleasant, but it didn't jeopardize the lives of the people. But in 1941, these people who up to now were only working in Hungary were also sent outside Hungary, and in the light of the advance of the German troops, Horthy didn't want to give soldiers to the